What is up, everyone? My name is Matthew Dale, and I am here to help you play better, sound great, and understand more. And in this video, I'm going to explain why I am a Fractal guy, why I love the Fractal ecosystem for guitar effects, and why I enjoy using these fantastic products. Now, contrary to popular belief, usually when you are a guitar player that is presenting themselves on the internet as someone that is using digital modelers and direct devices and that sort of thing, typically the go-to is, well, that guy's probably never ever heard a tube amp before in his life. But I assure you, I've played many a tube amp. In fact, I'll put up a couple of pictures here of some of my previous amps and previous rigs. But I used to be very much a nothing but the best tube amp type player. At the time of this video, I am currently 33 years old, and I probably got my first tube amp somewhere around the age of 16. And after learning guitar and playing guitar for so many years of plugging straight into like a solid state little practice amplifier or something that was maybe one tier up from there, getting a really nice tube amp is an eye-opening experience. And of course, everyone knows the magic that happens when you crank up the tube amp to the point where the tubes saturate and you get that wonderful tube compression and crunch. And that's where I sat for a number of years. I didn't really get into pedals until a couple years down the road when I was probably about 19, 20, 21. And when I did finally get into the pedal game, it was, well, I need true bypass. I need these all analog circuits. I need to go with these boutique builders, right? So some of my first pedals were made by Keeley Electronics. Then I got really big into JHS. And of course, I also use some of the run-of-the-mill Boss pedals and MXR pedals. I've also had my experience with Earthquaker Devices and another small company called DMB. They don't make pedals anymore, but they made some really interesting designs, and so on and so forth. I lost so many hours of my life looking at YouTube videos and just trying to ascertain what was going on in the pedal market. And I definitely say waste as a joke. It definitely wasn't time wasted. I definitely learned a lot about different pedals and guitar effects in general from that time spent on the interwebs watching a whole bunch of demo videos. And I used the traditional setup of a tube amp with an analog pedal board plugging straight into the front end of the amp for many, many years. Happily, I might add. And as a player, as a teacher, as a gigging musician, it was really good. So I would bring the tube amp for the size of the gig I was playing, use my pedal board, and I'd have all my effects there at the ready, and I was generally happy with the tones that I would get. Now, I think at probably the height of my pedal collection, I had somewhere in excess of 30 pedals. Definitely not the biggest collection of some people out there, but it was more than enough that I needed because I didn't use all those pedals on one board at once. Otherwise, I'd have this, huge, massive surfboard of a pedal board. Now, I really started to kind of shift my perception in 2018 when I started touring. I was hired on to be the second guitar player in a band called The Prophecy Show. We are a Trans-Siberian Orchestra tribute show, and as a part of our stage setup, we were going cabinetless. So what I did that first year is I found a cabinetless solution that I could use in conjunction with my existing rig. So I got a Hughes & Kettner Redbox DI, and I got an 8-ohm 100-watt load box that I would plug my amp into. So pedal board plugged into the amplifier that was plugged into the Hughes & Kettner Redbox, and then that was plugged into the load box, and I could send a mono XLR feed out to front of house. And at the time, this was definitely the most inexpensive option for creating something of a direct rig rather than buying, a completely new modeler or other devices. The Hughes & Kettner Redbox was like $100 or $150, and then the 8-ohm load box was around $60 or $70 at the time or something like that. Now, when looking at this rig, it's kind of like a snake pit, right? There's cables everywhere, and there's also a whole bunch of cables that are attached to the pedals in between the pedal board, to the pedal board, the looper, the amp, everything. There's just cables everywhere, right? And generally speaking, all of those cables need to go through a line check or something of a line check every time you plug in because they would fail. Now, I was using George L. solderless cables, and I probably would have had better luck if I would have gone with a soldered route, but these were pretty easy to make and fix on the fly. But I still ran into a number of issues where I'd have a bad cable from time to time. And not to mention, this rig also took a bit of time to set up. This definitely wasn't the fastest way of setting up at a show. And for that next year in 2019, I thought, okay, well, maybe I dip my toe in the modeler world and maybe I try out one of these new devices coming out. And if nothing else, it would be a great backup to have when I need to go cabinetless. And a lot of the modern modelers available at the time, that would have been the Helix, the GT1000 just came out, the Fractal Axe 8 would have been out at that time. I think the Headrush board was out or was just about to come out, something like that, 2018, 2019. All of these had stereo XLR outs, which made setup a breeze. You just plop down wherever you're going to be, and then XLR in, bam. And then you also have the benefit of going stereo. So after more and more time spent on YouTube looking at more and more pedals, this time modeling effects, I went ahead and I decided on this, the GT1000. Now, not exactly this. I had the big brother to this, the GT1000 big regular floor unit, and then later on I got this as a backup rig to that main unit, the GT1000 Core, which is all the same architecture, just the switching is a little bit different, but all the innards are basically the same. Now, I used that rig really happily for that entire year. I probably got that in the first quarter of 2019 to kind of gear up for my tour coming up in the fall of that year, and I wanted to really kind of hone in and dial in my sounds for that. And what I found was pretty striking. Even though I'm using kind of this mid-tier modeler, something to just get my feet wet and just to try out, I was using this modeling device more than my tube amps and my big pedal board of boutique effects. It was much easier to set up. It was easier to dial in at a certain volume. Like I could play, at any volume that I wanted to. I could use headphones and play completely silent. I could turn it up and it would sound really good through some FR speakers or some studio monitors or like my QSCs that I have down on the floor here. It just made things a lot more convenient. And certainly for me, that convenience outweighed any sort of negative tonal stuff that might be happening. But I really didn't notice any sort of negative effects on my guitar tone. In fact, I actually got more compliments after I had been gigging out with that GT1000 pedal unit from a lot of people that I know and trust for guitar tones. After a little while of having that board, I played a church gig at a church that I had played a lot for and used my analog pedal board and my various amps and whatever, and I used this little GT1000. I played there, and one of my friends came up, also a guitar player, really good musician, and said, I don't think I've ever heard you sound better in this space. And that to me was kind of the proof that was in the pudding. If my setup was a lot easier, plug into the wall, one cord into the wall, and then stereo XLR, and then plug my guitar into it, and then all of my sounds are preset. I don't have any other small cables to double check, and okay, if I'm not getting sound, which one is the problem? Okay, that one, I hope I have a replacement for that one. Everything was just saved in this basically computer, and now I'm getting compliments that say that I'm sounding better than the tube amps and the expensive effects and that sort of thing. But keep in mind, I sound better through a live system. Now, pound for pound, I think inside of a room or inside of a studio, I don't know that I would necessarily sound better if I had the GT1000 through the nicest PA speaker versus my pedal board into the nicest tube amp, something that I probably didn't even have. In that sort of controlled environment, it very well may make a difference. You might hear all those subtle nuances of a really nice tube amp. But in the real world or in the performing world where you're going into a soundboard and you're going into a mix and you're going out to an audience and you have monitoring on stage, whether that be in-ears or floor wedges, the modeler gave me a better result. So then after this experience, I finally said, you know what? I think I'm ready to take a little bit of a bigger plunge. When I was looking at modelers, the one that I really wanted was the Axe 8. I heard that one, I'm like, that one just sounds like it's miles ahead of the Helix and the GT1000. That's on another playing level. But I went ahead and I went with the GT1000 because I wasn't really sure if this modeling thing would be for me. And then after that experience, I'm like, okay, well, I'm going to sell the big GT1000. I'm going to get an FM3. They're roughly the same price, and then I'll go from there. And there were really two huge benefits to switching from the Boss ecosystem into the Fractal ecosystem. One, there's just a ton more amps, right? Over 200 different amp models in this thing, where the Boss GT1000 had like 16, and they were these idealized amplifiers. So, you know, the Brit stack is kind of like, okay, maybe it's a bit of a Plexi, maybe it's a bit of a JCM 800 with the master volume. It wasn't really this super accurate modeling device. It was created to basically make finding tones a little bit easier. So it's kind of guessing at, okay, well, if you want like a Marshall stack, you probably are going for something like this sound, and we'll make it easier for you to get there. Where the Fractal is hyper accurate to the real world counterparts. If you pull up a Plexi model and you dime all of the dials on the authentic page, then you get that sound. If you dial in the Fender Magic 6s, then you get that sound. The thing that I really liked about the Fractal was the hyper-accurate amp models. And that also trailed into the effects and everything else that's in there as well, all based around these real-world counterparts. Another big thing for me was the robustness of the chassis rather than this aluminum. These were like steel chassis, a little bit heavier of a metal. And probably one of the biggest things was also the cable that goes into the power cable that goes into the back of a Fractal is an IEC, a standardized power cable. The Boss GT1000 has a 9-volt supply with its own power supply. Now, you can probably power this with like a power block, or I think I've even powered this with like a one-spot or something as well. But that's kind of a dinky little, barrel jack 9-volt power supply. And on the road, I don't have multiple ones of those. I might have, one or two spares, if that. But on the road, in our lighting rig for the Prophecy show, we've got pounds and pounds and pounds of IECs. So if there's an IEC power cable that goes out, just grab another one. And that's something that I really like that was on the Fractal on the FM3. That's also like that on the Helix as well. And the other thing that was a crazy benefit for me deciding to go the Fractal route was the fact that Fractal continuously strives to perfect their products even after you purchase them. At the time of filming this particular video, firmware 21 just dropped for the Axe Effects, and firmware 6 for the FM3 is just about ready to drop as well. So clearly they do a lot more firmware updating on the big Axe Effects rigs, but they also do a lot of firmware updates, improving things, adding things for the other products as well. And that just wasn't something that I got with the Boss. They had one sort of system update that, fixed certain bugs in there, but they never really did much to add more effects, certainly not in the scale that Fractal does. So after I had my FM3 for a few months and I was using that and I was loving it, I went ahead and decided to, you know what, I'm going to get rid of the vast majority of these pedals and even my tube amps, the ones that I'm not using and I'm not plugging into anymore. They're just collecting dust. Why don't I get an Axe Effects, and why don't I build out a touring rig that would make things even easier for me? And that's when I started putting together and assembling my tour rack. So in this rack, I have the Axe Effects 3. I've got my wireless, my Shure wireless system. I've got my wireless in-ear system in there as well. Of course, a power supply, a power conditioner to power everything. And then I've also had a rack panel made to make the connections even easier. I don't have to go around to the back. I can plug everything into the front panel and go from there. A nice benefit for me is having this over on the side of a stage and running the FastLink cable, the NXLR cable, out to where I want to control the Fractal. And I can put this basically anywhere given the length of the XLR that I use. So each rig is definitely going to have its own compromises associated with it. But for me, going the Fractal route just made the most sense. And at the end of the day, if I can find ways to make my sound better, if I can find ways to make my setup easier and faster, I'm going to do it. And the Fractal, for me, the FM3, the AXFX3, ticks all of those boxes. So that is a little bit about my journey going from an analog tone snob to a digital disciple and using the Fractal AXFX and the FM3. If you want some great tips on how to get the most out of your Fractal rig, then download my Fractal Favorites Amps and Cabs guide. You can find that link in the description box below. If you found this content helpful, then go ahead and hit that like button, and remember to hit that subscribe button. I would love to hear your thoughts on whatever rig you might be using in the comment space below. Until next time, my name is Mathew Dale. Play better, sound great, and understand more.